America exists today to make war. How else do we interpret 19 straight years of war and no end in sight? It's part of what the American empire is.
Who here is ready for war?
The Third World War is not only inevitable, but is already taking place.
What begins as a regional war could very rapidly escalate out of control.
The Ukraine war is accelerating the decline of the West.
Painful trade-offs will be unavoidable.
Israel quietly concedes Iran now holds the upper hand on the battlefield.
The problem with wars is easier to start than to stop them, and it always gets out of hand.
Iran will be our Syracuse. That will be our end.
Hi, I'm James Patrick, the director of this film and interview series on World War III. In this interview, I spoke with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He was the former Chief of Staff of Colin Powell and a fierce critic of war. He discusses the moving center of power of the world, economic and political, over to Asia, and how the U.S. is fighting that trend militarily now, but it's a futile process that'll be our undoing. He also called the Iran war and said if America engages in war with Iran, Israel will be destroyed and the U.S. empire will be done. He called it.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, Colonel U.S. Army, retired, 31 years in the Army. After the Army, I worked for Colin Powell in a private capacity for about 3 years, and then we went to the State Department together in 2000. And I worked in the State Department as a policy planning staff member and then as his Chief of Staff for the last 3 years, up until 2005. And ever since that time, I've taught national security affairs at George Washington University and at the College of William and Mary. We lied about Vietnam. We lied about Iraq. We lied about Afghanistan. We lied about Somalia. We lied about Libya. We put more small arms and medium arms into the hands of terrorist groups the world over by not securing Gaddafi's weapons caches in Libya than any arms merchant has ever put into the world. Did the same thing in Iraq. We failed to secure Saddam Hussein's arm caches. We didn't have enough troops to do it, so we just left them for Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others to have their will with. When we found out there were 5,000 red eyes out there, shoulder-fired missiles, the CIA went around trying to buy them back, $5,000 a piece, no questions asked. You know, in 1945, the United States became the newest empire in the world. It became an empire of quite a unique feature, too, an empire with nuclear weapons. We're the only empire in 5,000 years of human history in which there have been hundreds of empires, large and small, to have the technological means to not only liquidate our enemies, but ourselves too, and maybe even disturb the balance of the planet. That's the uniqueness about the American empire. But in 45, we had 51% of the world's gross domestic product. Our main competitors lay prostrate at our feet, both allies and enemies. And we were probably the most extensive empire in the world, despite the British claim that the sun never set on theirs. We really owned the world in 1945. And ever since that time, the first part of which we were checked in our eagerness to be a real empire by a commensurate empire, if you will, on the other side, the USSR. Ever since that tension went away, ever since the Cold War ended, we have been berserk as an empire. Much the way empires in the past have been, whether you're talking about the Persian, the Roman, the Eastern or Western, the Byzantine, that it became in the Eastern Empire, or some of the smaller ones, like Hitler's Third Reich, which lasted not 1,000 years, but just a decade or so. Empires pretty much go the same way over time, some faster than others. We are the latest incarnation of that imperial instinct of mankind. Eisenhower in '52 made a statement that was probably more powerful than his one when he retired from presidential office. The one everyone knows about is his comment about the military-industrial complex and what a danger it was to our freedoms and liberties. Mm-hmm. Well, in 52, I think it was the American Society of Newspaper Editors, he essentially said, this is no way of life at all. It's humanity hanging from a cross of iron. That's a direct quote. And he was right. And it has become tenfold, if not 100-fold worse since Eisenhower. We now live to make war. And incidentally, we live to put sanctions on other people. The Office of Finance and Financial Assets Control at Treasury that monitors sanctions in the world now officially lists more than 30 countries that we have under sanction, and roughly 2 billion people in the world every day live under U.S. sanctions. This is truly empire. All empires decay, and all empires deteriorate, and all empires collapse. Anyone that said differently would be arguing with 5,000 years of human history. The difference with us today, as I said, and it is a potent difference, is we can arrest our fall with nuclear weapons. Interestingly enough, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has a long history, and it goes all the way back to the time when I was Chief of Staff to Powell, even before that when I was Special Assistant to him when he was Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're talking 1989 to 1993 for the Chief of Staff, and then we're talking State Department 2000 and 2005. And I'm watching what's happening as Gorbachev brings down the Soviet Empire, and the first president is experienced, competent, and smart, George H.W. Bush, having been Vice President to Ronald Reagan for 8 years in a very, very difficult situation because he and Reagan did not see eye to eye on most issues. He comes out and he's president, and he is the perfect president, if you will, to be there when Gorbachev does what he does with the Soviet Union. At those meetings, Powell in particular, as National Security Advisor to Ronald Reagan, he started it in 88 and 89. And then as chairman for Bush, he kind of gets into the middle of it. And in 93, when Bush is defeated, Bill Clinton takes over, and in that year, we get to see the transition. But I'm monitoring it all along from an academic point of view. So what's happening is you get Helmut Kohl, Francois Mitterrand, John Major, Maggie Thatcher, Jim Baker, Edward Shevardnadze, Mikhail Gorbachev, George H.W. Bush, all in more or less concert with regard to the end of the Cold War. That is to say, as the president himself said, in my presence, I will not take advantage of this situation. Later, he would say, we will not only not take advantage, we're going to use this moment to create a new world order. Along comes Iraq and the first war there, and that is his statement about the new world order. He uses the United Nations, doesn't rebuff it, gets a UN Security Council resolution, and builds a coalition of over 600,000 soldiers, including the Syrians, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Americans, the British, and does exactly what the UN mandate asked him to do, which is to remove Saddam's army from the country it had aggressed against, Kuwait. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to establish the UN as a powerful entity to enforcing international law in the world, the most important element of which was no crossing another country's borders and aggressing against it. But that ended. And the promise that he made to Gorbachev about NATO not going 1 inch further to the east, you have to maintain the arc that we've set up. I call it an arc of crisis, in order to stop this movement, this inexorable movement of power away from the American empire and its vassals in the Western Hemisphere, like Europe, to China. It's our way to bleed Russia through proxies so that we don't have to do it. Now, magnificently, we have allowed a tacit alliance between 3 of the most powerful countries in the world, China, India, and Russia. We've compelled that to happen.
So it's a dwindling U.S. influence going east.
Absolutely. And you start in the Arctic, you move down through the Baltic, you move down through Ukraine, you move down through Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, and down into Iran, and you have the entire line call it an attack line, if you will, that the United States and its vassal states are using to arrest this movement of power towards China.
But they can't stop it.
They can't stop it. It's inexorable. So that's the reason I say this is extremely dangerous. We will, when it becomes quite clear to us that all these proxy wars from Iran to the Baltic Sea to Ukraine to the Arctic aren't working, in fact, are operating against our interests rather than for them, we'll use nuclear weapons to ultimately take on whatever is left of whatever we're trying to defeat, which is going to be 3/4 of the world. This is a suicide mission. Look, let's just examine some realities. 1 in 5 people in the world is Chinese. 2 in 5 is Indian or Chinese. 3 in 5 is Asian. And if you parse it closely, you'll find out that the majority of the world is lining up as rapidly as one could think possible in a geopolitical, geostrategic atmosphere like we have today against us. We are minuscule compared to what's happening on the other side of the world. Only it's not just the other side of the world, it's 3/4 of the world that's lining up against us. And we are reinforcing that lineup by what we're doing.
So it's just the government, the military, industrial complex sort of run amok?
Those are instruments, those are tools of the oligarchs who are behind this. And when I say the oligarchs, people say, what are you talking about? I'm talking about people who have billions and billions of dollars of personal wealth and who watch all of this from different political perspectives, different financial perspectives even, and they are very frightened about the shift of power that's taking place from where they're very comfortable, the West, to where they are not so comfortable, the East. Israel has more billionaires per capita than we do, and we have a god load of them. These billionaires have different interests in what I'm describing is happening. When you talk about Charles Koch, who covets greatly Maduro's oil in Venezuela, you're talking about why we have Marines off the coast of Venezuela right now. It has nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with Venezuela's having the greatest oil deposits in the world. You got others in that whole complex, Robert Mercer, Sheldon Adelson's wife, Miriam Adelson. You've got others who aren't so visible, like Peter Thiel, very much behind the vice president. But all of these people have a decision to make. They either jump ship, go to Britain now, leave France, leave Germany, wherever they were, or they stay and ride it out and hope that the disaster is not as bad as it looks like it's going to be. That makes for a lot of tension behind the executive leadership of the empire, especially when the executive leadership is really a clown and circus show that doesn't know from day to day what it's doing and is being manipulated by each one of these elements that is behind it and pulled in different directions. People think all this vacillating and mercurial nature is Trump. It's him in some respects, but it's him also responding to these people behind him with whom he knows he couldn't exist were they not there. And the only way Ukraine could win over Russia, win in the traditional sense of win, is if we use nuclear weapons on Moscow and then we all lose. Americans who are hard-bent to support Ukraine through anything, thick or thin, are simply ill-advised. And that's what our media has done. We don't have a media that searches for the truth in any respect anymore. What we have is a media that shills for the government and its regime and policy of the moment. The Russians have, as they have said all along, Sergei Lavrov being most explicit in this, but Putin too, no designs whatsoever on anything other than that which presents an existential challenge to their sphere of influence. Read the Collective Security Treaty Organization. That's the only reason they are doing what they're doing in the special military operation. It has nothing to do. They'd be insane to take on NATO because they would know that they would ultimately wind up in a nuclear war. Well, Trump has got a choice now, and I think he's at least apprised in his mind of this choice. He can either cut and run completely, which he's not going to do because he can't do that. He doesn't have the courage. He can resume massive support, which will simply mean no relations with Russia worth a damn, to include renewing New START, the only nuclear weapon treaty left, and eternal hostility between Moscow and Washington, which he doesn't want. Or he can stiff the Europeans and say, it's yours. If you want to continue this war, do so, but you do it totally on your own, which they will not do, not for very long anyway. They don't have the capability to. And go above it all and say to Moscow, I want a new relationship. Economic, financial, and most of all, I want you and me and Xi Jinping to sit down at the table and construct a new nuclear weapons arms control treaty system, period. Well, I think I think we'll have a war if Netanyahu has his way, and he probably will, with Iran before Christmas. And I think if we go in to back him up, and we'll have to because Iran will be defeating him, we will have to go in and back him up, then we will be defeated too. Right now, I think the 12-day beautiful war proved that Israel cannot win a war with Iran, that it will be devastated by a war with Iran. And that's partly because it's committed on so many fronts right now and taking on so many challenges. It's trying to take massive territory in Syria. It's trying to take the whole of Lebanon. It covets Iraq. It covets Jordan. It covets Egypt. It even is coveting parts of East Africa. This is the greater plan of the Zionists. It's in history. It's there. This is the greater Israel. The only way Netanyahu can survive politically and actually survive is to keep going. He can't back up. So if he goes to Iran and we back him up, we'll start with air power. That will not do it. We'll have to put troops on the ground. And when we put troops on the ground, say goodbye to the empire, because we'll be there 10 years, $10 trillion, and it'll look worse than Iraq or Afghanistan when it is come to that 10-year point. Think of anything that we've been involved in the last 20, 30 years in terms of wars, and other than the first Gulf War, all of them have been abject failures. This one will be the failure to top all failures. Do I think the American people go along with this for some reason, visceral reason or whatever? I think you have to parse that really hard and in complex ways, because they're, for example, take these 75 million dispensationalists, we call them fundamentalist Christians. They look at the Rus, the Russians, as the foot soldiers of the Antichrist. So that's why you have a lot of really visceral hatred for Russia that's inexplicable amongst Americans, and especially those Americans who support Trump. Well, you have all kinds of complex factors like that playing into this. And I would say that you have a real good chance, if we go to war with Israel against Iran, or were we to go in big time against Russia in Ukraine, not only of producing a nuclear holocaust, but also of dismembering the empire internally. Think of California, think of Texas, think of the Northwest. There are reasons why. There was a book written one time called The 9 Nations of North America, somewhere towards the end of the 80s, early 90s. And there are pressures that are now being exacerbated, particularly by MAGA, that could separate states from states. People say, well, it can't happen. Take a look at history. This is what happens, especially to countries that are held together by cement that begins to fragment and melt, and people begin to go in different directions. Trump is getting ready possibly to put the same kind of military apparatus in Chicago as he's got in Washington, D.C. I'd say there's a 50-50 chance he will do it within the next month. National Guard troops from red states, basically, in Chicago, armed to the teeth. And Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, is right now eagerly weeding out all the military people who disagree with the kinds of policies Trump is implementing and replacing them with people who agree. This looks a lot like a much smarter coup d'etat in preparation to me than the one that occurred on January the 6th. I've said before, that January the 6th effort did not fail because the system held. It failed because the coup plotters were incompetent. They shall not be incompetent again. The Europeans do not have the wherewithal to take on Russia. At the end of our Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant had 1 million men under arms. There had been European observers and others, Asians for example, on almost every battlefield of consequence, all the way from Antietam to Cold Harbor. They were shaking in their boots, as were their prime ministers and presidents across the world, because they thought 1 million men, that's the largest, competent, battle-hardened army in the world. They are not going to stop with their civil war. In a decade or so, that army will be unleashed on us all. They were really worried. Look at their cables back and forth. They were very worried. So what would happen with the Russian over 1 million today, who are battle-hardened, as competent as any troops in the world right now, with a defense industrial base that dwarfs ours, that can produce more artillery rounds in a month than we can in a year, more missiles in 2 months than we can in 2 years? What would they do with that with respect to the Europeans? Beat the crap out of them. That's what they do, and we'd be into a world war. We have a saying amongst my retiree community in the Army, were we to go to war significantly today, 85% of the 18 to 24-year-olds in America would be in Canada or Mexico the next week. Really? That's how ready for a big war we are. Number one reason on many of the polls, and in the top 3 in almost all of them, is I don't want to die in a stupid war that isn't for U.S. national interest. The most disquieting factor of recruiters and recruiting stations when we talk to them is that that's happening, that in fact their richest pool of potential recruits, the military families, is drying up because families are telling their young people now, don't go in the military. Well, I saw one of the worst false flags that the United States staged in, I think, my time in the military, and it occurred very much so with regard to Afghanistan, which was to a point understandable after 9/11 had occurred. That we had to do it the way we did it was not necessarily understandable. In fact, many of us advised against the manner in which we did it because we didn't think it was designed to get bin Laden and his crew. It was designed to show the American people that, you know, we'd been asleep at the switch, but by God, we were going to do something about it, and it was going to be massive. Then comes the war that was absolutely uncalled for, that Kofi Annan said was a violation of international law, was a war crime, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. It was just a target of opportunity that Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, George W. Bush, and I'm sad to say my boss, Colin Powell, did not object strenuously, came across and executed. And they executed it because they felt, for different reasons, that they needed to do it. None of those reasons, and my students have explored all of them, there are about 8 basic reasons, depending on who you're looking at. None of those reasons was in the interest of the American people. The only person who rivaled Mother Teresa, if you remember Mother Teresa, in polls with the American people was Colin Powell. And that was precisely what they were using because he had it. He was given the opportunity to help the administration with this war I just described as being useless and against the law. So they used that, knowing full well they were using it, and he knew they were using it too because he admitted as much to me, to convince the American people to support the war against Iraq in 2003. He said that he would always regret that. And I said it was the worst point in my professional and private, personal career in my life. In the late January 2003, he came into my office and he threw a package down on my desk and he said, "We're going to the UN and we're going to present the case for war." He didn't say that. He said, "We're going to present the case to disarm Iraq at the United Nations." I said, "Why us?" Adlai Stevenson gave the Cuban Missile Crisis briefing at the UN. How come you have to go up there and do it as the Secretary of State? You asked me that question, he said. I knew the answer right away. You're the only one in the Bush administration with the credibility to do it. So I sat down at my desk, I looked at the thing, I said, this is a damn lawyer's brief. That's all this is. I can't build a presentation around this. It'd been written by Scooter Libby and John Hanna in the Vice President's office. So I made that complaint to him, and he said, well, we'll see if we can't make it better. We're going to write here and state the human rights violations piece, and Phil Mudd at CIA is going to write the terrorism piece of it. So we'll merge them all together, and we'll rewrite the one at the front that right now reads like a lawyer's brief. He said, I'm going to be there. You're going to be there? Yeah, I'm going to be there every day. Most of the time I will be there. This is the Secretary of State. He's going to be right there with me. So every time we're briefing, Tenet's in the center, or Secretary's in the center, Tenet's on his right, and I'm on his left. 7 days and 7 nights we do this. He only put 2 analysts in front of us, Robert Walpole and Larry Gershwin. I should have asked 1,000 times over, how come I'm not hearing from any other analysts in the bowels of the CIA? I'm only hearing from these 2 guys. Because later I would learn these 2 guys were more or less working for Dick Cheney, the vice president. They were rewarded and promoted after what was one of the greatest intelligence failures of the era. They were promoted and given bonuses. Think about that for a minute. The vice president made 11 trips to the CIA, unprecedented. So what we were doing was putting together the briefing, the vice president's office and the Office of Special Plans under Douglas Feith, a dual citizen who was surrounded by Mossad the entire time he was in that office, whom Rumsfeld walked out of his door one time and down the hall and so forth and said, I don't run this building, Israel does. He was referring to Mossad, of course, being in Feith's office. Mossad came and went from the Pentagon, regardless of the entrance, most often the river entrance, without any credentials. They were given carte blanche in the Pentagon. Well, I think our interests were congruent with Israel's. I don't even think Rumsfeld realized that. I think Cheney realized that. I think others realized that. I think Cheney convinced Bush of that. And when I say congruent, it was that we were contemplating what's happening right now. We were thinking about the clean break strategy that the neoconservatives principally had put together. And that strategy had 5 countries in it, the last big one of which was Iran. So we weren't stopping in Iraq. We were going to go on to Syria, on to Iran, and maybe even further than that. And we were going to do that until Iraq became an insurgency. And we realized we couldn't handle Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria simultaneously and move on to Iran. Thank God that happened, because that would have been the end right there had we done that. But that was the plan, to do that. And Powell knew nothing about that I don't think, when we went to the UN to give the presentation. And we both thought that what we had gotten at the CIA, that we had compelled and squeezed and tortured to the point where we thought we could trust it, was at least circumstantial evidence, good circumstantial evidence, that Saddam had failed to disarm. It wasn't. It turned out to be a colossal intelligence failure, as well as a failure on our part to challenge Tenet sufficiently to get him to fess up that he really didn't have an ironclad case. It was not a slam dunk, as Tenet allegedly said in the Oval Office to the president. Powell was having serious reservations about a number of aspects of the briefing, one of which was the NSA intercepts of conversations between Saddam's generals and his troops in the field that indicated there were weapons of mass destruction. We played some of them at the UN, but we didn't play the most damning one. The most damning one actually revealed critical sources and methods that would have, were it true, endangered U.S. troops' lives, massively so, if we invaded, because they involved chemical weapons, and those weapons being used on U.S. forces. When Tenet told Powell, you can't use that, Powell said, wait a minute, that's the most powerful thing the National Security Agency has captured in conversation between Saddam and his generals. And I can't use it? No, because if you use it, it will indicate to them that we know. And so they will shift what we know and still use it on the troops. So you can't use that because it will give them warning ahead of time that will cause them probably to use it on the troops. Powell's an old military guy himself, of course. He says, okay, all right, I won't use it, I'm convinced. I've subsequently learned that all of that was absolute apocryphal bullshit. I'm convinced that the intercepts were ones we captured, and if we captured them in total, they were genuine. If we captured only part of them, they were cherry-picked, and they were cherry-picked to support our case. If we captured them in whole, they were completely out of context. I think it was a crafting of the intelligence to support the case that was not justified. We were taking care of the clean break strategy. We were not only cleaning up the Levant for our interests, we were cleaning it up so that Israel in the residual years could do what it needed to do to police it for us. Israel was going to become the Shah. Remember, we had the Shah of Iran who kind of did this for us for so long, and incidentally was a good friend of Israel, and Israel a good friend of his? Yes, very good friends. Yeah. Money-making good friends. Yeah. Well, we lost the Shah, and so we were going to substitute the cleaning up, the clean break strategy of the Levant for the Shah, and Israel was going to become the Shah because we would have cleaned it up for them. If you want to know, can Europe militarily, or I would say almost any way, any power way, financial, economic, whatever, take on Russia as it currently exists and win, I would say you were pipe dreaming. Because number one, Russia's economy is cooking on at least 6 out of 8 cylinders right now. It's cooking particularly on the cylinder that says defense industrial base, and I've got a lot more than you do, and on technological development within that base, read Oreshnik type missiles, hypervelocity missiles. And Europe's is really, really floundering, particularly its economic, dynamic engine, Germany. Merz is not long for this world. The only reason he's there right now is because of the convoluted German political apparatus, which elects somebody without a majority all the time. Merz will be gone very shortly when the German people realize what has happened to them. We're in real trouble in Europe. There's no question about it. And Europe is going to have a hard time staying in a cohesive whole. Regardless of what Ursula von der Leyen thinks, Europe is got numbered days right now in terms of its unity and its ability to do anything through that unity. I think we're looking at the disintegration of NATO before our eyes. I think we're looking at the commensurate disintegration of the European Union before our eyes, perhaps taking a little bit longer. And I think we're looking at one of two distinct possibilities. As we said in 1991 and 2 to the Germans and to other Europeans like Francois Mitterrand in France, you need to stand up and develop your own security identity, and we'll help you. They didn't do it. We'll either be looking at that finally happening. Europe will come together, principally the big countries, and develop a European security identity and work out the architecture of that with Russia, or they'll flounder and fall apart. My bet, searching history, is they'll flounder and fall apart. The U.S.-Israel relationship right now is a disaster in my mind because I don't think Trump in any way, fashion, or form understands the nature of what's happening right now in the Levant. And primarily what's happening with this idea that Netanyahu has that, one, I'm for the greater Israel of the Bible, and 2, it's the only way I can survive politically and maybe actually survive. And so he's put those two things together, and he is hell-bent for leather now. And I don't think Trump realizes that. Just yesterday, he finally admitted that there might be some starvation in Gaza. Israel is conducting a genocide, and they're doing it in a way that just rankles every war crime criteria in the world, to include killing people through starvation. Knowingly killing people through starvation. They have knowingly killed more journalists in Israel, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere than have been killed in the wars between our civil war and the present day. Yeah, Israel is right now taking on more than it can ever possibly handle. It's taking on fully in its face Lebanon. It's taking on increasingly in its face Syria, and these talks I don't think are going to go anywhere real substantive. It's taking on fully in its face Gaza. It's taking on the West Bank in a way that everybody in the world who knows anything about the West Bank is opposed to. And it's taking on essentially and seriously, once it gets into and buried in Lebanon, a revived Hezbollah. And it's going to war with Iran. I mean, I don't know how Israel survives that. Israel believes, as the United States believes to a certain extent, that air power, the bombs dropped by air power, and those things associated with the air power can defeat another nation. All of history since the beginning of air power screams that that is not the case. I've said Israel will not be a state. I'll repeat, and I believe this deeply, Israel will not be a Jewish state within the next 10 years. Probably more imminent than that. And I'm beginning to think Israel will not be an entity constituted as any kind of state whatsoever within the next year to year and a half, because it will be roundly defeated on the battlefield along with its big daddy, the United States, or better said, the American empire. Because we'll go into Iran, and that will be our Syracusa. That will be our end. Israel is a tool of the American empire. It is doing, as Lindsey Graham says all the time, it is doing our bidding in the Levant. Lindsey Graham actually said on the floor of the Senate, "What are you talking about, people? If Israel weren't doing this," meaning killing the Palestinians, "we'd have to do it. Better they do it." In purely military terms, Israel has taken on far too much to handle. It will therefore turn to the United States when that too much to handle includes Iran and a renewed war. And the United States and Israel will, as it were, go down together. Americans do not appreciate the true cost of war, and let's examine why. It's really quite simple. They have not been in one in their lifetime. They have not been in a war where bombs landed on their front yard, where grenades went off in their living room, where people died in the street in front of their house, where blood ran like water through the streets. The American people have not seen war. Arguably, they have not seen war since 1865. They didn't see much in World War II unless they were part of the apparatus fighting it. They didn't see hardly anything in World War I unless they were the few people who fought in it. In terms of population, it was very few. Americans do not know war, period. They will fast forward to seeing war that is full of mushroom clouds and death, because that's where we're going. If we continue on our current path, we're going to nuclear war. There's so many pressures pushing us in that direction, one of which is the old typical modern empire way of getting out of massive debt. That's to start a huge war that you think will liquidate all that debt. Well, this huge war has to go nuclear ultimately, because too many nuclear-armed states will be party to it. This won't be Pyrrhic even. This will be the end of the human race as we know it. And that's not apocalyptic. That's the truth. We have enough nuclear megatonnage on a single ballistic missile submarine, as do the Russians, to set human life back to the Dark Ages, more or less. And we have 100 times that. We could obliterate the human race without question. There is some geophysical evidence that we might even start the Earth on a spiral that would end the Earth itself before it burns out in 4 billion years or whatever into the sun. We would speed that up. I mean, I'm not sure I follow all that, but it is, when you think about the megatonnage that's available for use, even if only 80% of it works, we're going to destroy ourselves.
And so maybe on the inverse solutions are What would not be stupid?
What would not be would be to accommodate this inexorable power shift to the east, to agree to have some sort of consortium of powers in the world. I can name the ones that would be at the top of that consortium. They would be Japan, they would be the United States, they would be the Russians, they would be the Chinese, they would be the Indians, and maybe the Brazilians. And you might have a second tier. I'd still probably leave out Paris, London, Berlin, unless they change their ways. And you would accommodate one another. You would accommodate this power shift. You would recognize China as the #1 economy in the world. You would recognize India for what its potential is in that regard, and you would recognize Russia for what its potential is in that regard. All of that complex is the future. You would accommodate that, and you would work with it to handle two massive existential crises we all face: the climate and its changing nature, and nuclear weapons.
From a diplomatic, political point of view, it would be being friends, trading, have peace, have good trade, have good relations.
Exactly what Constantinople did to extend the life of the Eastern Roman Empire, and exactly what the Persians did in probably the most powerful empire the world's ever seen. For a long time, they accommodated Jews, Christians, agnostics, Zoroastrians. They accommodated everybody. Their emperors, their leaders were very ecumenical. They were very tolerant. They realized that to have trade and economic success, you needed to tolerate all these different people operating in your empire simultaneously. You needed to protect them, such as you could at that time. The Romans, for example, if you were a Roman citizen, you could be miles and miles, hundreds, thousands of miles from Rome, and evoke your Roman citizenship, and people would quiver. You actually had something in the way of state power. Well, that's the way to run. That's the way to run the world, I think. A consortium of great powers and others beneath, aspiring to be great powers maybe, but you run it with the eye on the challenges that will wreck you all. I think the Democratic Party has been more blameworthy and more responsible for stupid wars than the Republicans. However we might parse that and say that the outcome of that has been an individual who's so mercurial, Donald Trump, and so vacuous that we don't know that's true anymore. Both parties seem to be as interested in war as one another. And I would hold that opinion too. I would say both the Republicans are trapped in what we call the military-industrial congressional complex, as are the Democrats. So we're damned as a people because neither of our major political parties, and we've created this system, we've created this damn system which protects both of them and won't allow a third one to grow up. We've created it, we made it, we are responsible for it, and it is killing us to have these two political parties whose differences are minuscule when it comes to rape, pillaging, and plundering the world, and this is important, their own people. I do think that there are signs out there that the American people, as it were, are waking up to some of these problems. But I also sense, and I get emails to this effect every day from people I've never met, and some of them are pretty smart people, they're professors, PhDs, saying it's too late. It's too late and there's no way to arrest the deterioration. We are in fact historically declining and it's impossible to stop it.